Is the United States going to finally pass a comprehensive infrastructure bill? Well, hot off the presses, it looks like it's getting closer. Bill Culhane, the host of The Big Bit Theory, a special episode of the show. Not very often that we jump right back into the studio and put out an episode that isn't quite on the regular schedule, but with all that's going on with U.S. infrastructure, we agreed that it was certainly appropriate. And based on how long we've been talking about U.S. infrastructure on this show, just 2 episodes ago, Dr. Joseph Schofer from Northwestern University came on it and talked about U.S. infrastructure. A $550 billion package, new federal spending on the way. Some of the breakdown, $110 billion in funding towards roads, bridges, and major projects, $66 billion in passenger and freight rail, $65 billion to rebuild the electric grid. Those of us here in Texas, of course, will never forget what happened to the power grid here in Texas back in February of 2021. $65 billion to expand broadband internet access, so on and so forth. Our guest, our special expert in this episode, is going to join us from over in DC. Emily Feenstra is the Managing Director, Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE. ASCE, many of you know, ASCE represents more than 150,000 civil engineers across the globe. It's America's oldest national engineering society. Emily is currently the Director of Infrastructure Initiatives and Public Affairs for ASCE. Emily is responsible for overseeing ASCE's government relations, including federal and state legislative affairs, regulatory affairs, grassroots and policy development, in addition to media relations. She earned her bachelor's degree in public policy studies from Duke University, go Blue Devils, and a master's in public administration from the University of Washington over in Seattle. Of course, we have a connection to Seattle. We have an office over that way. Sit back as Emily and I visit to discuss U.S. infrastructure, to talk about the most recent report card put out by ASCE, and also the news about the Senate passing the infrastructure bill. Now it's in the hands of the House of Representatives. Here's my conversation with Emily Feenstra.
Emily Feenstra joins us on the TBBT hotline. Emily, understanding that particularly today, these are very, very busy times, we appreciate you sharing some of your time with us today.
Oh, sure. Happy to be here, and it's an exciting day.
It sure is, and we'll talk more, of course, about the infrastructure bill in a moment, but we'll back up a little bit. I already mentioned, and many folks listening to this episode are aware that one of the things that ASCE does is formulate and publish a report card on U.S. infrastructure. And essentially, for those who possibly don't know, it's a process of researching, evaluating a broad spectrum of different aspects of infrastructure. Okay, Emily, in 2017, the U.S. was graded at a D+, not a great grade. Well, 4 years later, the most recent report card, ASCE assigned a grade of C-, not a major improvement. So clearly there is still a lot of work to be done. For those not familiar with the report card, Emily, can you kind of give us a 35,000-foot view on the report card? And if you could also tie in the 2021 report card, what would you consider to be the more notable findings from that evaluation?
Sure, happy to do that. Well, the Society of Civil Engineers, we've been putting together our report card with our civil engineer members actually every 4 years since 1998. And we started the report to kind of shine a light on what are out of sight, out of mind issues for most communities, although certainly they're more in the conversation today. But people don't think about the water until there's a pipe break or a water main break, or think about the roads or bridges until there's a closure or a detour. So we've been putting out this information in kind of easy to understand format. And in 2021, our latest version, yes, you saw a little bit of progress, inching up to a C- over 17 categories. We like to celebrate progress. There were 5 grades that went up. We're seeing good investment at the city and state level in particular. You see local ballot initiatives, including in Austin, I believe, pass. People want better transit. They want better water systems and parks. So there was progress, but I'm a parent, so we know that a C- is nothing to celebrate quite yet, and there's 11 grades still stuck in that D range, in fact.
Certainly room for improvement there. There's little doubt about that. You and I, before we started recording the episode, I mentioned to you, Emily, and I know you were already aware, but for our longtime listeners, they recall that back in 2017, Greg DiLoretto joined us. A couple of years ago, your predecessor, Brian Palish, a friend of the show, he stopped by. Mm-hmm. In that time, many of Greg and Brian's responses were consistent. I recalled as we had the conversations with those two gentlemen, the response to the question, why does U.S. infrastructure need to be addressed? I'm going to ask you that question for some. I think some folks who drive down the road and they see the pothole, or they hear the stories about water in Flint, Michigan, and other anecdotal examples. Maybe they kind of understand why U.S. infrastructure is such a point of emphasis. But what would you say to anybody who said, Emily, what's the big deal?
Sure, that's a fair question. And I think, infrastructure is such a part of the fabric of our quality of life. We depend on clean drinking water. We depend on transportation systems to get where we need to go. And the fact is, the U.S. has taken really a generation off from making the investments that we need to. Just like if you put a roof on your house 30 years ago and didn't think about it and didn't make any repairs along the way, you'd need to do a complete overhaul. And there's been some work done around the margins, but we've kind of lost that federal government partner when it comes to infrastructure. So it's such a part of our quality of life for all American communities. And especially as we look now, we can see more than ever in Texas and across the country, as we see this extreme weather, we see our infrastructure is vulnerable. So whether it's the power grid that goes out or flooding that happens over and over again in communities. And the final tie is really to our economy. And we kept getting the question, so what that we have a D+? What does it matter? And we can see that all those things that intuitively, you hit that pothole or there's a water main break that shuts down a business, those add up to real dollars and cents. And we worked with a team of economists and calculated that actually costs the average American household $3,300 a year just from kind of this deficient, unreliable infrastructure that we have.
I believe it was Tom Smith who was on NPR, Tom Smith from ASCE, not too long ago, and he kind of gave the analogy kicking the can down the road, and it seems like we've been doing that in this country. And for anybody, and this does require analysis, and I understand, and Emily, I think you understand as well, that maybe some people do have some concerns and questions about the need to address U.S. infrastructure, but I encourage everybody there's a link to the ASCE report card in the description of this episode. Go down there and just look it over and take in that information, and it could very well answer some questions that you might have. But onto the bill itself, and you and I, again, as we spoke before we started recording the episode, you and I kind of joked, Emily, that this is kind of breaking news. This episode of the show, the infrastructure bill has been in the news, and as you and I sit here, and it's a date and time stamp, today's August 10th, Emily and I are having this conversation, noon Eastern, 11 a.m. Central. The Senate has the votes. The Senate has indeed passed the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, of course, and not to be overlooked, the next step is the House of Representatives. Well, Emily, I'm from Maryland, as some of my listeners know, so I kind of know the geography. You're about 30 miles or so from the steps of the Capitol. What are you hearing from your experts and insiders on what's ahead for the bill, potential timeframes, what's next?
Sure, and maybe to pause a moment, for what just happened now in the Senate. I mean, this was kind of a historic moment, the Senate passing the bill, and it was a strong vote, 69-30. In the partisan environment we find ourselves in, that's a pretty major achievement. So we're happy with today, with the strong steps that the Senate took. that it was bipartisan, that I think people recognize that, this is popular with American communities. It's something that we're going to see benefits in our states and cities and towns. So really happy to see just kind of this milestone today. That said, the work's not done by any means. And so now the bill, that $1.2 trillion is $550 billion in new spending covering almost all of our report card categories, really. It moves to the House. And the future is a little more uncertain in the House. The House is actually on recess. They're on summer vacation, as you might call it, until September 20th. So there's already speculation brewing. And in fact, we have a small office on Capitol Hill, so we're stone's throw away right now. But speculation brewing that maybe Speaker Pelosi will bring back the House early to vote on this bill. How much is it tied to, budget reconciliation? Some of those are the questions that are immediately coming to mind, and all sorts of opinions on what happens next in the House for this bill. But I think it's a great signal to see that strong vote from the Senate.
In your response, use the word bipartisan. As I watch the votes, that's one thing that I found particularly encouraging. So, Emily, we have people from every industry, every walk of life listening to this episode on the public sector side, private sector side. Everyone understands budgets, the need for funding, especially a bill, and you put out some dollar figures there, but especially a bill that is this ambitious and far-reaching. In your expert analysis opinion, what are some of the better options for funding this bill?
Sure. There's a number of pay-fors or funding options being debated and kind of associated with this bill right now. And I would say it's a menu. And traditionally, user fees have funded a lot of the transportation elements. So, for example, the gas tax, we've paid the same amount in the federal gas tax since 1993. And we always say, imagine if you were even working in 1993, imagine living off your 1993 salary. You would not want to. But nevertheless, with the pandemic and kind of the fragile economic recovery, raising the gas tax wasn't really seen as a viable option at this time. So there's some, looking at COVID relief funds that were not spent. There's some cryptocurrency changes in management in the mix. There's a lot of things in the mix right now. And again, just pointing back to the economic kind of tie to infrastructure, I think the most important thing to keep in mind as all of these different options are discussed and debated is that there is a long-term economic multiplier when you invest in infrastructure. And again, you need your ports, your seaports to be well functioning. You need your roads and rail to connect to those ports. You need your airports to not be over congested for the economy to keep on humming and for the economy to grow. And conversely, when we have that kind of unreliable infrastructure, the inland waterways that break down, the water pipes that break, that acts as a drag or an anchor almost on our economy. It drags it down. So whatever funding we come up with, you're going to see that return on investment. You're going to see those benefits go far beyond construction and those typical industries. They're going to reverberate throughout the economy.
I particularly caught the number of times that you used the word investment. This, of course, is spending. It's a lot of spending involved in this bill, but it is certainly an investment as well. And it's something that's a long time coming. This country has fallen farther and farther behind in so many aspects of infrastructure. And when I have conversations with people about U.S. infrastructure, there are still many people who, when they hear the word infrastructure, they think, oh, you're talking about roads, streets, and bridges. But as you and I think, have established during our conversation, infrastructure, you mentioned 17 categories. U.S. infrastructure is far more than that road you drive down.
Absolutely. That's something I think, at least in D.C., has been a little bit forgotten in the conversation. but just how comprehensive and holistic this legislation is. And it involves complicated, overlapping jurisdictions. It was hard for Congress to piece it together because there's so many committees that deal with these issues. But yes, it touches on, again, your energy grid, your water systems, even things like hazardous waste and school facilities, making sure they have the best HVAC systems in place. It hits so many of those elements of physical infrastructure that need to work together. I think although we break down into our categories to issue the grades, it's really a connected system, and it's only as strong as its weakest link.
No doubt about it. Well, again, Emily, it's an exciting day indeed. How can our listeners stay in touch? Anybody who wants to follow ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers?
Sure. So we've given a glimpse of the report card, but would really encourage anybody who's interested to check out our website. It's infrastructurereportcard.org. You can see maps of how your state, fares compared to other states, a really deep down analysis for all of those 17 categories, lots of information there. You can take action there as well.
One final time, I encourage everybody, go to the description of this episode and you'll see that there's a link to ASCE for your convenience, and then also the 2021 report card. There's a link to that study as well. And if you go to ASCE's website, incidentally, you can go back and look at the previous report cards as well. Well, Emily, I know you have still a lot of work to do today and in the days ahead. We appreciate your time and all the best.
Great. Thanks so much for chatting today.
The Big Bid Theory is brought to you in part by Bid Prime. Over 11 years in changing the bid services industry, Bid Prime has become the solution for businesses serious about winning public sector business. From the premier technology in the industry to real-time bid notifications, supporting documents, and robust data tools, it's all backed by unmatched personalized customer support. Bid Prime. Start your free zero-obligation trial today. bidprime.com.
Infrastructure, it's something that I've mentioned on this very show in front of this very microphone for so long. There have been a number of contracts put out by federal, state, and local governments over the years addressing infrastructure. All of the aspects you can think of when it comes to infrastructure, but clearly there has never been, certainly in the time of this show, 7+ years, there has never been anything as comprehensive as what we see going on today. So exciting times indeed. And that's going to do it for this special episode of the Big Bid Theory. Do appreciate everybody for listening, sharing, and downloading. If you know anybody who is at all tied in to infrastructure, any of the 17 or so different areas of infrastructure, please share this episode with them. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at the Big Bid Theory. You can follow me if you want to give me a follow. My personal Twitter is contract_hunter. Don't forget we're on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. Powered by Bid Prime. That'll do it for this special episode of TBBT. Many thanks to Rick Jennings behind the scenes. Rick will be back next time on the show with his crazy bids you can win. You certainly don't want to miss that. I want to pass along our thanks to Kevin Longley from ASCE, who helped coordinate our visit with Emily. Thanks to Emily Feenstra for sharing her expertise. And again, it was such a neat moment for this show to actually be in studio having a conversation with Emily as she's there in DC, kind of a witness to what was going on as the Senate was finalizing their vote. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a regularly scheduled episode of the show. Can't wait to see you then. This is Bill Culhane. Until next time, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs. And we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Powered by Bid Prime, we thank you for tuning in to the Big Bid Theory. From Austin, Texas, the show is produced by Bill Culhane and Jim Ward. Producer and engineer is Rick Jennings. You can find other episodes of the show on platforms such as iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, among others. As always, thank you for downloading and sharing the podcast.
We're having so much fun.